The injustice towards Russian women. This is Margarita Gracheva. She's a Russian mother of 2 children who had her hands cut off with an axe by her husband. She had reported to local law enforcement of her husband's violent actions prior to this incident, but received no help. It is Russian law that abusers cannot be arrested unless the victim is hospitalized. And so Gracheva's husband was only arrested after she was hospitalized. Gracheva's story is not uncommon, with many Russian women facing the crime that is domestic violence. Russian protesters cannot properly speak up about domestic violence in fear of being physically harmed. Jacob Lawrence shows in his painting, Confrontation at the Bridge, how African American protesters were met with violence from law enforcement, shown as a dog ready to attack. Jacob Lawrence shows how when there's violence inflicted on protesters, it makes it difficult for citizens to properly speak out about issues in their society. So similarly, many Russian citizens have tried to combat the issue of domestic violence. However, they are met with violence from their government when they protest. Violeta Gregoria describes protests in Russia as "you can go on strike and get beaten," was her statement after she had fled from Russia, according to Elena Palinova, a Russian journalist. The risks Russian citizens face if they were to protest has limited domestic violence rates from possibly being lowered. Diana Marie Divanota, the head of the Center of Domestic Violence Survivors, reports that 1 in every 3 Russian women experience domestic violence. Now, the question that should be asked is, why is there a high prevalence of domestic violence in Russia? The reason is due to the decriminalization of violence against women and police negligence. Decriminalization of domestic violence is one of the causes that have caused the high prevalence of domestic violence in Russia. Olympia Usanova, a human rights activist and lawyer, found that domestic violence in Russia is viewed as a private matter and that women should obey and endure violence from their husbands. The Russian Orthodox Church also promotes the ideology that women are second-class persons meant to serve men. In addition to Usanova's findings, Marie G. Minerva, a professor of Russian law and administration, found that the Russian Orthodox Church justifies domestic violence of husbands abusing their wives as the right of the husband to teach and discipline his wife. This is seen as a part of the traditional values of Russia. The Russian Orthodox Church has used the excuse of maintaining traditional values as an excuse to manipulate Russian politics. Kay Rollins from Harvard University found that in 2012, the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, had reformed the Russian constitution. This had resulted in losing support of many Russian citizens, the most significant of which was from the Russian Orthodox Church, that say that Putin had violated Russian tradition. So to get the church voters back, he had appealed to decriminalizing domestic violence. A comparable instance of corruption like the Russian Orthodox Church is the United States government in the treatment of Native Americans. According to Melinda Janko, she found that Eloise Kobel had fought the United States government in the corruption of taking oil off of Native American reservations and not given proper compensation. Just as the United States government had swindled Native Americans of their oil money, the Russian Orthodox Church has swindled the rights of Russian women of domestic violence. Essentially, domestic violence is lessening the seriousness and punishment of a crime. Olga Samuka, an assistant professor of criminology and law studies, informs that an amendment was passed that decriminalized domestic violence from a crime to an administrative violation. Adding to this, the article, Russia Bill to Decriminalize, had found that only second offenders, or when the victim was seriously injured, were the perpetrators convicted. And that when the abuser was convicted, they only received a minimal fine, an administrative arrest up to 15 days, or community service. The decriminalization of domestic violence is outrageous because the perpetrators only get a slap on the wrist while the victims are still suffering. And a perfect example is Margarita Gracheva, because she's a perfect example of what happens when domestic violence is decriminalized. The second reason for domestic violence's high prevalence in Russia is because of police negligence. Joanne Della Gisita from the Criminal Justice Department found that when Russian police officers are confronted with cases regarding domestic violence, they often refuse to help because they do not view domestic violence as a crime, and they use excuses such as domestic violence is a family matter and that they have many more important cases to deal with. However, when they do actually do something about domestic violence, they make Russian women submitting a report very difficult. Throughout the entire legal process, domestic violence victims are met with discouraging attitudes from Russian law officers, such as hostility, reluctance, and bias against their cases, saying things like, well, he didn't kill you. With Russian law enforcement not helping domestic violence victims, there have been many cases just like Margarita Gracheva. Galia Navia is a professor at the Department of Modern History and World Politics, found that Valeria Voldia was a 34-year-old woman. She had submitted 7 complaints of assaults that her husband had committed against her, including beatings. When she had asked for state protection, she was denied of this, and she ended up fleeing Russia and changing her name. Similar to Navala's findings, Ali Nair, a freelance journalist who focuses on Russia, found the story of Yulia Belova. She was murdered at the time when she was pregnant by her husband, who had also brutally murdered their 6 children. It was discovered that after Bolivia's death that she had submitted multiple police reports. However, nothing was done to help her. The lack of help from law enforcement has severely made domestic all the more prevalent in Russia, since they are not helping domestic violence victims. In conclusion, the prolonged presence of domestic violence in Russia is because of the decriminalization of domestic violence and the lack of help from police officers. And so the violence displayed towards Russian protesters has limited from domestic violence rates from possibly being lowered, along with the Russian Orthodox Church manipulating the Russian government to decriminalize domestic violence has been a severe injustice towards Russian women, since the perpetrators guilty of domestic violence are not being properly convicted for their crime. But what has been the most significant reason for Russia's high prevalence of domestic violence is because of police neglect, since they are practically leaving Russian women defenseless against their abusers. Domestic violence is an injustice to Russian women that should be properly dealt with.
All right, Calista. How did some preliminary information you gathered from early sources inform your research?
One of my first sources was Kay Rowlands. She had given the story of Margarita Gracheva, and she had shown how police negligence and how Russian laws had limited Russian women being able to have domestic rights. And so that further led me to find that, such as in Joe Al Delagita's findings of how the results from the punishments from decriminalizing domestic violence, such as the minimal fine, the administrative arrest up to 15 days is reduced. So that showed me how the police, of how the laws just not helping Russian women at all had led to this. And also along with the results also of, I tried to find other women who had also had stories like Margarita Gracheva. And so that also led me to further understand how Russian women do not have the rights that they should.
Okay. And your second question, what additional questions emerged from your research? Why are these questions important?
Well, my additional questions were, how is traditional values so influential in the decriminalization of domestic violence, and how the Russian Orthodox Church played a part in that? With my research from Kay Rowlands, of how when the president of Russia had tried to reform the Russian Constitution, and the results from him the Russian citizens totally not agreeing with this, and how the Russian Orthodox Church basically got what they wanted in their beliefs, as I previously stated, of how they believe that women are second-class persons, showed how the traditional values have been an influential factor in decriminalizing domestic violence for women, and how also the Russian Orthodox Church has such a high influence in Russian politics, thus the corruption.